Week 32, Overview, Captains of Industry. This week, we continue our study of life in the Gilded Age. Students at all levels will read about the single term of President Benjamin Henry Harrison. He was the Republican who defeated Grover Cleveland, then lost to Cleveland in the election at the end of his one term. Harrison's term was a difficult time for most Americans as the pace of change continued to dismay and threaten people. Urbanization and industrialization rocketed along as Americans pursued wealth. Immigrants continued to flood the country. Farmers struggled to survive and demanded aid from their government. The laboring poor remained in oppressive circumstances and grew increasingly desperate. Veterans of the Civil War cried out for increased benefits and pensions. In hindsight, it's hard to see how any one man acting as president could have met the needs and desires of all these jostling segments of American society. Grammar students are reading about the leading industrialists of the era. Lower grammar students focus on Andrew Carnegie as a representative of this group of business leaders, while upper grammar students meet several more of these captains of industry. Rhetoric level students will be learning about these men in even more detail. Dialectic students continue studying Carnegie, but they focus on millions of other immigrants too. They'll be reading about the people, experiences, and stories of Ellis Island. It's a busy week, so where should we start? Let's start where so many new Americans did, at Ellis Island in New York Harbor. The new immigrants at Ellis Island had to prove that they were mentally and physically healthy and ready to become Americans. They were inspected before they were admitted, and these inspections were serious business. About 2% of the immigrants were sent back home because of contagious illness, past crimes, political reasons, or just because the inspectors didn't think they could support themselves in their new country. The inspectors had a big job, trying to process so many people from so many places. Just trying to spell their names could be next to impossible. They did the best they could, but many immigrants came out of Ellis Island with new names that bore little resemblance to what they'd been called back home. The immigrants who made it through began to pass on tips on how to beat the system. For example, new immigrants had to prove they could read their own language, so some memorized passages to make it look like they could read. They had to prove they had $25 of their own money, so they often borrowed the $25 they needed to show the inspectors, then paid the money back before they left. In some cases, immigrants would secretly pass the same $20 bill from one passenger to the next in the inspection line. Some poor immigrants became wealthy and powerful. Dialectic students have been following the life of Andrew Carnegie, whose family left Scotland for a new life in America when he was 13 years old. Grammar students will learn about him too this week. When Andrew came to America, he worked in a cotton mill in Pennsylvania, then got a position as a messenger boy, which gave him a chance to see the big city of Pittsburgh. From an earthly perspective, Carnegie had what it took to succeed. He was diligent, friendly, and humble, yet full of enthusiasm. He always wanted to learn new things. But there were lots of new Americans who were just as eager and curious and hardworking. He and his fellow messenger boys attended the theater together and formed a debate club, which they called the Webster Literary Society. God put opportunity into Carnegie's path. A very kind, wealthy man allowed the messenger boys to borrow books from his enormous library. Carnegie took full advantage of his generosity. He never forgot how much that one man's kindness meant to his future. After a year and a half, Carnegie had been promoted from messenger boy to telegraph operator. He made good money and was able to provide for his family. Soon he became his boss's right-hand man. By the time he was 24 years old, he had risen to a very important position within the railroad industry. Carnegie tried to live a moral life, though he wasn't a Christian. Carnegie was a fervent social Darwinist. He wrote an essay in 1889 called Wealth. This Gospel of Wealth, as it became known, held that the vast differences between rich and poor were just as they should be. Although Carnegie didn't have any objection to the rich getting richer, he had strong ideas about what wealthy men should do with their money. He didn't believe in just giving it away, whether to one's heirs or to the poor. Both the idle rich and the idle poor were all too likely to waste what was handed to them. But as a poor boy who had gained his education by reading books from a rich man's library, he softened the harshest edges of social Darwinism. Carnegie thought that men of wealth should consider how best to help those who will help themselves. He was against any kind of government intervention in the market, and he opposed charity as such, but he was all in favor of rich men voluntarily creating resources that would allow poor people to improve themselves. For instance, towards the end of his life, after having enjoyed his own riches for years, Carnegie funded over 2,800 public libraries where the poor could educate themselves the way he had. Now, despite Carnegie's lofty aspirations, ordinary Americans didn't really trust these super-rich social Darwinists. Big business was proving to be hard on employees, hard on consumers, and hard on other businesses. Big business was hard on its employees. They made high profits by paying low wages, and if workers complained, they lost their jobs. When businesses gained a monopoly in the market, it hurt consumers too, who suddenly had no other choice for products. They were hard on other businesses too. Railroad companies became notorious for price fixing, kickbacks, rebates, and other unfair practices that tilted the playing field against smaller businesses. All in all, the giant corporations were good for their owners, but hard on everybody else. As concerned citizens, journalists called muckrakers, and reformers publicized the miserable conditions in which the urban poor labored and lived, public opinion turned against these magnates, and people started to demand regulation and reform. The Grange was formed by disgruntled Midwestern farmers. Labor organizations like the Knights of Labor were formed, and violent strikes broke out. Congress responded to the public outcry, enacting the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act to give the government a role in regulating big business. The president who oversaw these changes was Benjamin Henry Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States. Back in week 15, we learned how that first President, Harrison, died from pneumonia after only 32 days in office. William Henry Harrison's grandson, Benjamin, joined the Union Army during the Civil War and fought with valor. He was promoted to brigadier general. After the war, he practiced law and became a senator for Indiana. He ran against Grover Cleveland, whose popularity was now sagging. Cleveland thought it was beneath the dignity of a sitting president to actively campaign for re-election. The election was close. Cleveland was ahead in the popular vote, but his Republican rival won it in the Electoral College. 6 states entered the Union during Harrison's presidency, more than in any other single presidential term. There was a reason for that. The Democrats, under Grover Cleveland, hadn't wanted to admit states that might vote Republican, but Harrison was all for increasing the number of Republican senators. The northwest corner of the American map filled up with the new states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington. Grover Cleveland lost the election to Harrison because he refused to raise tariffs or provide pensions for Civil War veterans. Harrison took the opposite tack. He signed a bill that set tariffs at record levels, but farmers felt it benefited businessmen instead of farmers. He signed a pension bill that almost doubled the cost of veterans' pensions. The number of government employees also skyrocketed. That was a lot of money, and the Treasury was running low on gold. At this point in America's history, the Treasury accepted both gold and silver as legal tender, but the price of silver was falling because of big mineral strikes. People paid their taxes in cheap silver, but creditors demanded payment in gold. Some people wanted free silver. Others wanted a gold standard. Harrison tried to split the difference by coining more silver without tying its value to gold. That disappointed just about everybody who had an opinion on the subject, which included more and more Americans. By the time Harrison ran for re-election, America's farmers had lost confidence in the Republican Party. Many joined the new Populist Party in protest against sagging farm prices. We'll study that new party in detail in week 34. Factory workers left the Republicans too. The Populists got 1 million votes in the election of 1892. Harrison lost to Grover Cleveland, the original comeback kid, by less than 500,000 votes. As Carnegie noted in his essay on wealth, the new models of commerce inevitably produced enormous differences between rich and poor. Some grew fabulously wealthy and powerful, but the new methods of conducting business had a human cost. Laborers worked long hours in terrible conditions for little pay so that businessmen could profit. Smaller competitors were purposefully undercut when they stood in the way of big business leaders. Despite these negatives, we don't take the position that these men were evil robber barons who ultimately hurt America. With all their all-too-human failings, these leaders accomplished much that was positive. Like it or not, they pioneered the modern capitalistic system by which Americans do business today, which has been the most successful economy in the history of the world so far.